Good day. As all recent programs have been, this program is again going to be about the global crisis relating to the situation in Ukraine. And as is traditional, I'm going to start with a discussion of the situation in Ukraine itself. Now, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most of the more sober analysts that I've been following on every side, on the Russian side, on the Ukrainian side, and the various independent commentators who discuss and write and make videos about this war, including people with military backgrounds like Scott Ritter, Jacob Dreisen, Douglas McGregor, Larry Johnson, all those sort of people. The most important event by far, which has taken place in Ukraine over the last week or 10 days, is the capture of Popasnaya by the Russians and their allied forces in Donbass, and the increasing encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk urban conurbation. And I want to stress again that this includes the assessment of many Ukrainian commentators whom you find on Telegram and in other places that I have also seen. And this is certainly creating, it seems, concerns within the Ukrainian High Command. Shortly before I appeared on this program, I read a report whose complete authenticity I cannot, by the way, confirm, but which I believe to be true, which is that the Ukrainian command, the High Command, has ordered a redeployment of troops away from the ETHEREUM front towards other areas of the Donbass to try and plug the gaps caused by the fall of Popasnaya and the encirclement of the troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Now, I would add that, in my opinion, this decision to try to deploy troops forward to try to plug the gaps in the Donbass is a mistaken strategy. I believe that the correct strategy in this kind of situation is to try to withdraw the troops from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and to redeploy them, or rather first to rotate them, give them rest, give them opportunities to recuperate, to tend to the wounded, to do all the things that have to be done, and then to redeploy them experienced and skilled troops, as they doubtless are, to plug the front lines, the new front lines that are going to emerge once this part of Donbass has fallen. That seems to me to be the logical strategy. Well, I'm not a military person, so perhaps I'm wrong, but the Ukrainians seem to be taking another view. It seems that the troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are staying where they are. There were some reports a couple of days ago that a brigade had withdrawn from Lysychansk, but if so, there's been no word that any more Ukrainian troops have withdrawn from those two towns. And instead, it seems that, as has been the consistent pattern throughout this war, the Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are being given stand and fight orders. Now, that looks to me like a case of reinforcing failure, but, well, no doubt Ukrainian commanders and leaders can explain it. I've made my own opinions about this entirely clear, and I'm not going to take up time repeating them in this program. Anyway, that seems to me by far the most important news event in terms of the actual fighting. The fall of Popasnaya and the encirclement of the Ukrainian troops, said to number around 8,000 in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And again, just before I started making this video, I saw a report that Russian and allied troops have now actually started to enter into Severodonetsk itself, that they've captured 12 apartment buildings on the outskirts of the town obviously this is only the beginning of what looks like a major battle, a battle which will no doubt repeat some of the patterns that we saw in Mariupol. Anyway, that, as I said, seems to me overwhelmingly the most important news on the battlefields. You will not get that impression, as I said yesterday, by reading the Western media. Yet this morning, in fact, yesterday evening, The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, did finally publish a report about the fall of Popasnaya and the encirclement of Severodonetsk. It was buried in a lengthy article which gave the impression that the fighting in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, is in a state of stalemate. This was based upon testimony given by a military official, a US military official, to Congress, alongside the more important testimony given by the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, which I also discussed in a previous program. Anyway, The Guardian focused on what it claimed was a stalemate in the fighting in the Donbass, but squirreled away deep down inside this article was an admission that Popasnaya has fallen. This is several days after that news was first reported, and Severodonetsk is in the process of being encircled. The casual way in which this, I think, important news has been slipped in really takes my breath away. And I would say that elsewhere in the British media, there still seems to be a resolute refusal to talk or comment about these important developments. Anyway, elsewhere, the British Ministry of Defence has been providing its own comments. And again, several days after the Battle of Snake Island, which I've been discussing in several programs and which many people have discussed, several days after that, the British Ministry of Defence also gave its own account of what happened during the Battle of Snake Island. And it is remarkably different from what I've been reading from Russian, including Russian Ministry of Defence accounts, but also from many Ukrainian accounts. Allegedly or supposedly, or at least the British Ministry of Defence, makes no reference to any Ukrainian attempt to capture Snake Island. There's no suggestion that there was any amphibious assault on Snake Island or any attempt to capture Snake Island on the eve of Russia's Victory Day celebrations in order to spoil the parade. Rather, what has happened is that the Russians have supposedly suffered losses as they try to resupply the garrison that they have on Snake Island. And the British Ministry of Defence then talks about how if the Russians manage to consolidate their control of Snake Island, they will install powerful anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles on Snake Island, thereby dominating this part of the Black Sea. And the Russians, according to this British Ministry of Defence program or bulletin, are supposedly suffering losses as they try to consolidate their control of Snake Island with this particular purpose, and their resupply ships or boats to Snake Island are coming under attack from Ukrainian Bayraktar drones, and one of them at least has been destroyed. That was the British Ministry of Defence version of what has happened, but note that it's only been released several days after the battle itself has taken place. I have to say that this account is so diametrically different from the Russian account that one is almost left to wonder whether what is being described as is the same battle. Well, I'm not physically present in this part of the world. I can't obviously vouch for the total accuracy of Russian accounts of the Battle of Snake Island. But as I have said, those do appear to be confirmed from Ukrainian sources, which also speak of heavy losses as the Ukrainians try to capture Snake Island. So it does seem to me inherently that the Russian accounts are the more reliable accounts. There's something else, which is that the British suggestion that the Russians were planning to pile advanced anti-aircraft and anti-ship missiles on Snake Island seemed to me to make no allowance for the tiny size of the place. If you actually see pictures of Snake Island, you see what a very, very small place it is and how bare it is. And of course, Snake Island is also within range of long-range Ukrainian artillery from Odessa, which also, it seems to me, makes the idea of installing large, sophisticated installations of anti-ship and anti-aircraft missiles on the island problematic, to say the least. I'm going to add that I saw a rather breathless further report on the BBC describing these alleged Russian plans after repeating the British Ministry of Defence's account of the battle. And it spoke of the Russians planning, or perhaps considering, installing S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems there. Well, I've seen photos of the S-400 missile system and its accompanying vehicles and radar. And this is a massive system. It involves lots of vehicles. It obviously needs a large supply of ammunition, of reload missiles to keep the launchers equipped. I can't conceive that there is anything like the room on Snake Island to host a system of this scale and sophistication and complexity. And I have to say that this whole idea of the Russians turning Snake Island into some sort of fortress seems to me so, frankly, fanciful that it is another reason why I am deeply sceptical about the entire British account of the battle. Now, that does make one wonder, actually, again, about the accuracy of the information that we're getting about the fighting in Ukraine from Western governments, and specifically in this case from the British Ministry of Defence, which has taken the consistently most triumphalist approach to all Ukrainian advances or shall we say defences. And given that, as far as I can see, they're getting the Battle of Snake Island so completely wrong, and given the delay in publishing this information, I can't help but think that what has happened is that what we're seeing here is a case of damage limitation. The British know perfectly well what actually happened on Snake Island, but after an attempt to lie low and say nothing about it, some sort of explanation had to be given, no doubt because journalists from the British and other media were asking questions, and eventually this really rather odd story about a Russian attempt to resupply the garrison on Snake Island and to build up elaborate anti-ship and anti-aircraft installations on the island was cobbled together in order to explain away what has happened. Well, if this is correct, if this is what the British Ministry of Defence is doing, then all I can say is that that's profoundly wrong. I can understand it when the Ukrainians give, shall we say, misleading accounts of events on the battlefield. They are involved in what is, frankly, a war. They have to keep up the morale of their soldiers and of their civilian population. They have to persuade themselves that they have a chance, and as all parties in conflicts do, they talk up the scale of their victories and minimize the scale of their defeats, or try to ignore them entirely. So I can understand why the Ukrainians might be doing this. But Britain is not a direct party to the conflict, or at least so it insists. Given which, why is the British Ministry of Defence providing bulletins which, as far as I can see, are completely misleading about an event like the Battle of Snake Island? It's obviously not to mislead the Russians. It's obviously not to mislead the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, by the way, have been fairly open in discussing what actually happened on Snake Island. It can only be in order to mislead people in Britain itself and indeed in the West. And that seems to me to be profoundly wrong, and wrong at many levels. Anyway, that leads up to the other big story that one reads about in the Western media, which is that, of course, even as you read very little about Popasnaya, I've only found, as I said, this little article in The Guardian, this little mention in The Guardian buried in a much longer article about other matters. Rather than talk about Popasnaya, rather than actually tell what seems to me to be the truth about the Battle of Snake Island, which is that the Ukrainians suffered a heavy defeat there, we get instead breathless stories about the great Ukrainian advance north of Kharkiv. And there are still, it has to be said, some uncertainties about quite how extensive this advance has been. But anyway, this has been very heavily promoted indeed. Now, I am again not a witness to the events on the ground, but there has now been some reporting, including from a BBC journalist who's been in the area. And the thing that came across to me reading these accounts is that there's actually been extremely little fighting over the course of this offensive. And I'm going to now offer my own personal suggestion, which is that this force, which the Russians and the allied militia had deployed near Kharkiv, was intended as something of a covering force to pin down Ukrainian troops in Kharkiv, to prevent them interfering in the bigger battles in Donbass, and also against the major Russian concentrations around ETHEREUM. With the fall of Popasnaya, the encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and with the further consolidation of Russian control over ETHEREUM, there's been some reports that the Russians have been able to capture more settlements around ETHEREUM as they advance steadily further south and west from ETHEREUM. That the need for this covering force so close to Kharkiv has gone. And from what I can tell, the Russians have done essentially the same thing that they did in Kiev, around Kiev back in March, when it became clear that the forces in Donbass, the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, had been pinned down and that an operational cauldron around them had been created. The purpose of holding on to all that ground around Kiev had gone, and the Russian troops were withdrawn from that area where they were playing no useful role. And I suspect something similar has happened with Kharkiv, obviously on a far smaller scale. So the Russians have pulled back some of their troops. Apparently they're still holding some villages on the Ukrainian side of the border, but the bulk of these troops may have been pulled back beyond the Russian border itself. And that, it seems to me, if I'm correct about this, is the Russians doing exactly what the Ukrainians are not doing, and what I am criticizing the Ukrainians for not doing, which is that the Russians are not throwing away lives of their men or material, holding on to useless or undefendable ground. They're pulling back, and they're pulling back in an orderly way. And of course, the Ukrainians are then able to reoccupy some of these villages and settlements and claim that they're doing so as the result of an offensive. That seems to me at least one plausible take of what's happening north of Kharkiv. There's some suggestions that this is all part of some great Ukrainian operational plan to cut Russian supply lines to the force in ETHEREUM. Well, I'm not a good map reader. I can't see how that makes any kind of sense to me. It would mean crossing into Russia itself, which I suspect the Ukrainians would not want to do. By the way, and contrary to what some have been suggesting, Ukraine already controls significant parts of its border with Russia following the withdrawal of Russian troops from the areas around Kiev, Chernigov and Sumy. So it's not unusual for the Ukrainians to reach their own border. It's located only 40 kilometers from Kharkiv anyway. So this is not an important offensive, if it is even an offensive. And as I've discussed in previous programs, the numbers of troops on each side seem to be relatively small. Anyway, this is the story that has been talked about by the Western media instead. And a offensive which may not actually been an offensive, but which has indeed captured some ground north of Kharkiv in what doesn't seem to me to be an important area of the battle, but no real discussion of the far more significant failures, indeed the disastrous failures of the Ukrainians further south in Donbass itself. Now, I don't know how long this can be sustained, and sooner or later, as Ukrainian forces in Donbass begin to crack, I think that people in the West are going to have a great deal of explaining to do. But having said that, I have no doubt at all that they will find their way to explain it. Anyway, that seems to me the major military developments as of today, as of the time of making of this video. Obviously, this is a fluid situation. Things can change rapidly from 1 hour to the next, and obviously the more information comes through, the more Alex Christoforou on his channel and I will try to keep you updated. Anyway, more news on the economic front. It seems that more and more European companies are now capitulating to Putin's gas for rubles proposal. Allegedly, another 10 have opened corresponding accounts with Gazprom Bank, and apparently another 14 are planning to do so. This even as Ukraine has switched off one of the pipes that is supplying gas to Europe. I wonder how long Ukraine will be allowed to do that, by the way. So that's one big story. But perhaps the big story today, the one that is gathering all the attention, is this rush to get Finland and Sweden into NATO. Note that there's not going to be much discussion. This is all being railroaded through at astonishing speed. There's not going to be referendums about it in Finland or in Sweden. The discussion in Finland, at least, and undoubtedly, I suspect, in Sweden too, appears to be happening almost entirely within elite circles and behind closed doors. The media in both countries is in a state of absolute agitation. The Finnish and Swedish media, by the way, have for a very long time been taking an extreme anti-Russian position, moulding opinion in both of these countries to view Russia as an enemy. And this decision is clearly going to be made, and it will no doubt be rubber-stamped by NATO in August, though there will no doubt be an interval of around a year before these two countries finally enter NATO. The way in which these two countries, which are not being threatened, there's no suggestion that Russia has any plans to attack either Finland or Sweden. Even the governments of those two countries don't claim that they see any imminent threat from Russia to Finland or Sweden. The way in which these two countries have been persuaded by their own political class to reverse their decades-old policies of neutrality actually does take one's breath away. I want to repeat again a point which I've made in the past. The Russians are taking this in their stride. From their point of view, Finland and Sweden have been aligned with the West for a very long time. Both of them, obviously, are members of the European Union, and Sweden has always been perceived by Russia, except for a certain period in the 1960s and 1970s, as an essentially hostile country. From a Russian point of view, Finland and Sweden entering NATO doesn't change the overall strategic balance. If in the event of a war, they would quickly ally themselves with NATO anyway, and they would quickly host NATO troops as well. I'm sure those plans already exist and have been prepared for a long time. But Finland and Sweden being part of NATO simplifies Russian planning in the event of a conflict with NATO in the Arctic and in the North Atlantic and ultimately in the North Sea. So that's, I think, that story. It is astonishing how it's being done. I am sure that if more time were given to debate this in both Finland and Sweden, we would see the doubts amongst the people there grow, and we would also see opposition start to crystallize and rise. The fact that it's been done in this incredibly rushed way strongly suggests that people in Finland and Sweden and in NATO headquarters and in Western capitals don't really believe that this turn away from neutrality in either of these two countries is to be firmly relied on, and that there is this rush to bring them into NATO, therefore, as soon as possible. Anyway, I happen to think that this decision, which, as I said, doesn't, it seems to me, make a great deal of military sense, is intended as something of a consolation prize for the NATO bureaucracy for the fact that, as I said, it looks certain to lose any prospect of extending NATO into Ukraine or indeed Georgia or Moldova as well. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about those. I'm getting more information all the time now from many places in Europe about the increasingly deteriorating economic situation. The inflation numbers of the United States, which were published yesterday, turned out to be significantly worse than the administration had hoped. The administration hoped that inflation in the United States was going to fall. Instead, it's remained steady despite the base effect and despite the fact that oil prices dipped over the course of April, largely, I suspect, because of the Chinese lockdowns. But the underlying inflation drivers continue to remain extremely high. And of course, if we're talking about everyday inflation, the inflation that affects people when they go and buy things, well, that is getting worse in the United States, and it's getting significantly worse in Europe too. And it's going to get worse still. And I've just had a comment, an email from someone I know in Greece, who tells me that his electricity bill has grown from 90 euros a month to around 300 euros a month. Now, my energy bills increased in April by 54%, not anywhere close to this huge increase that we've apparently seen in Greece. But of course, there's going to be a further increase in energy costs in Britain in the autumn, which is anticipated to be at the same level. And of course, we hear information about a baby formula shortage in the United States. We've had some echoes of that here in Britain as well, by the way. And I suspect that before very long, more and more food products are going to become ever more expensive, even as the US government tries to find ways to remove grain from Ukraine, which, by the way, is probably in need of that food itself, in order to try and steer off these surges in worldwide inflation. Now, I wonder how much longer this is going to continue before we start to see real political consequences. It's been pointed out to me by the American lawyer Robert Barnes, who joins us on live streams on the Duran, which I would highly recommend that you would see, that the number of Republican representatives who voted against the aid package for the latest aid package for Ukraine has now increased to 57, more than he himself had anticipated. So one does get the sense that there's a groundswell of opposition in the United States, and there's also increasing signs, or so I understand it, that the opinion polls are predicting heavy losses for the Democrats in the midterms, the November midterms. We haven't yet seen anything quite like that in Europe. There's not yet been an important election where the cost of living crisis has yet filtered through into the way people vote. Macron's victory in the French presidential election, to some extent, may have been reduced by the fact that more and more people are increasingly coming under economic pressure. But obviously, it's not been strong enough. That sentiment has not yet been strong enough to deny him victory in that election. But there are going to be parliamentary elections in France in June. Though I have to say that the lineup of the parties in this election is uninspiring, to say the least. And sooner or later, there's going to be elections elsewhere in Europe, and we will see what the outcome of those if that is going to be. But one thing does seem to be happening, even as the cost of living crisis across Europe continues to deteriorate and get worse, and that is that we're now starting to see the first clear signs that the Hungarians and the others, their pushback against the oil embargo idea floated by the European Union, is starting to have some kind of effect, and that their mood appears to be hardening. I read yesterday in the Financial Times that the Hungarian government now says that the only acceptable form of an oil embargo, buyer's embargo by Europe, would be an embargo on Russian oil shipped to Europe by tankers. Oil piped to Europe from Russia, which is how Hungary gets its oil, should be left unaffected. Now, as I understand it, most of the oil that goes to Europe from Russia is actually piped. Now, I don't want to get into the details of this, but that does look like a hardening of the Hungarian position. I wonder whether the Commission can accept that, and I wonder what's going to happen over the next few days. But the fact that the Hungarians seem to be hardening their position at the moment may be a sign that the economic problems that are starting to intensify across Europe are starting to have a political effect. Well, we shall see. That's all for me today. I look forward to you joining me again. Future programs on this channel. Please don't forget to check us out on Rumble and Locals, where you can join our Locals community and participate in my Wednesday live streams. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star. And also, of course, you can go to our shop and buy our great things there. Last but not least, please don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.